Welcome, everyone. Please, the last people that are sitting on the sidelines, please join us. We are getting started right now. So, welcome to the Tel Aviv International Salon event. We are very excited of hosting you all here at the WeWork at Shoken. We have a very special evening tonight, and I'll tell you why. Sitting on my right of me, the two people that we have here, Tamara, I hope you're not offended. I know that Michael won't be. We have two frayerim, or as Michael likes to say it, frayerim. Two people that are very, very successful, and we'll go through their bios in a second, but besides that, are very, very committed to creating a change in the world. And that is something that is very special to me. Michael, as a close friend, we've been in the trenches together. We've done a few chupot together and all that. But Michael, everyone knows, is a partner in Aleph. But I think even more important to know about Michael, if anyone knows Michael on his LinkedIn, he starts off in a very important seder of who he is, right? He's first of all and foremost a husband, then a father, grandfather, investor, right? But that tells the story of who Michael is. And that will also be the common denominator of the story of the book that we're going to go through tonight. But Michael is one of the founders and partners in Aleph, a VC that manages today over $500 million, has invested in many, many companies that we know and appreciate and we're proud of as Israeli high-tech companies. Besides that, has been involved and is in many nonprofits like HaShomer. He's the chairman of HaShomer HaChadash, and he's involved in many, many other incredible things that we will hear about from Michael very soon. Tamara, that I didn't get to know before this, but I was humbled when I read her resume, so you guys will. Tamara was born and raised in London in England to an Israeli mother and an Egyptian-born British father. She graduated from Harvard, and she worked for 6 years in media in different incredible companies that we'll just mention a few of them. She held the producer and executive producer roles in production companies in the UK and US. Artists such as Converse, MasterCard, Bob Dylan. I really like the fact that you worked with Bob Dylan. That's really cool. And many other incredible things. But I think the important thing, again, is Tamara was a flyer, and she got up one day and she said, I need to come to Israel. I want to create impact. It's not only about success and about what we do, but what is the impact that we live after ourselves. And today, Tamara is the co-founder of a very special startup company called RiseUp that basically takes the modern day technology and helps families leave poverty and be able to build a stable and strong financial life and household. So with no further ado, I will give the microphone over to our very special frayerim tonight. So please give a round of applause, and we should have a great evening.
So thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Rabbi Chen. He gave away a little secret here, which is now on Facebook Live, which is that I've done chupot together with Rabbi Chen. That doesn't make us a friar. That makes us in trouble, perhaps. But now it's public. So I want to thank everyone for coming. Nominally, this is a book launch of The Tree of Life and Prosperity, which is my recently released book in English, which is a translation and adaptation of the book in Hebrew, which is called Eitz HaChaim VaKesef. And I want to acknowledge my editor of all my Hebrew books on the parasha is here, Amit Miskav, Rav Amit Miskav. Thank you. And when we thought about the evening and said, who should the conversation be with, because listening to me would be boring, I thought and drove Andrew, who I also want to give a shout out to, along with Susan, who put together this evening. Thank you, Andrew and Susan. And he kept saying, who, and I kind of couldn't land on the right person, and finally I said, Tamara. And what I thought we'd explore tonight together is different roots and different examinations of what brought us to Israel, what brought us to do what we do, and then to reflect, perhaps most importantly, on this intersection between principles and values on the one hand and business on the other. my perspective will undoubtedly have more to do with the Torah, and Tamara's will have a different perspective. Tamara, sorry, will have a different perspective that we'll hear about soon. So I thought we'd start with is just let Tamara give her own background and her story of how she got to where we are today, and then I'll launch in.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for inviting me. So already you heard my my bio. So what essentially, I grew up I was born and raised in London. I went to Harvard. I spent 10 years in the US, and then one day moved to Israel. And the question that Michael asked me when we were talking about what we're going to talk about was why? You know, why are we freirim that we did that? And I think that for me, there was sort of a moment. I was part of a production company. We sold the company to to Vice Media, a big media company, and I sort of had a chance to take a step back and say, okay, what have I achieved, to sort of take stock of the situation. And I felt that I was very far away from my roots. I was living in LA. And I was missing purpose, I think, on two levels. One was the level of my day-to-day life, what I was working towards. I felt that there wasn't an alignment between my values and my work. And the other level was that I just felt far away from my parents. I felt far away from sort of the world that I came from. And when I came to visit Israel just for 10 days, I sort of had this moment where I understood that actually all of the sort of generations that came before me, and it sounds a bit like maybe a bit grandiose, but there was this moment where I sort of understood that my grandparents did what they did so that I could live in Israel, and I could, if I was going to create an impact, that it would be in Israel. My mother's father was the commander of the Exodus. He brought 25,000 refugees to Israel at the founding of the state. Before the founding of the state, my grandmother, who was no less courageous, she was an American woman from LA who moved to Israel in the 50s and dealt with everything that came with it. And so I felt, okay, this is sort of all of these, my ancestry has sort of built towards this point that I want to do it in Israel, and I want to continue to make an impact here. So then I moved here. I met my partner Yuval, and then my partner Iftach, and we started riseup. And what we do is we help people take control of their finances and start to get out of debt, start saving for their family's future. And we're focused on the Israeli market, which is also a very unique thing. Michael,
We'll come back to that in a second. Yeah.
So that's what I'm here and how I got here.
All right, so I'll jump in. Many of you have heard my background, and I've been reasonably explicit about it. But I grew up on the west side of Manhattan. My family's been there for a very long time. We were not in Europe when World War II struck as a family. So an American family, my grandfather on one side had a chemical business. The other one had like a local FedEx business that came after his service for the U.S. Navy in World War II. And my grandmothers were educated in America, and I grew up on the west side to a very, very Zionist family. And after high school, I came to spend a year in Israel learning in a yeshiva. In Yeshivat Har Etzion, there are a number of graduates here from there, Rav Duvdevani, Rav Miskav. And towards the end of my second year there, I had an experience with Rav Yehuda Mital, Zichrono Livracha, where I'm sitting in a room with 15 people, and I asked him a question of whether he thought there was a bigger mitzvah, a bigger commandment of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, of settling the land, to someone who moved to a populated place like Tel Aviv, Yerushalayim, or if you had to move out like to the Negev and the Galil, someplace unpopulated, in order to really do this right. And he looked at me and said, it's all nonsense. You need to move to Israel and create a factory that will employ 10,000 people to earn an honest and decent living. That would be the most important mitzvah. That would be the most important commandment. And literally on the spot, I decided I would move to Israel. It took me 2 more years. But it was the first time I had heard about the intersection of Torah, mitzvot, and the economy and business. And that was a real moment for me. And in large measure, the book and the insights are dedicated to Rav Amital. And since then, I made Aliyah. It wasn't like the 50s, but when you get here and You don't know people. I started in political consulting, was laid off, but nobody told me about it. But I've then spent the last 25 years in venture capital, investing in Israeli entrepreneurs and trying to understand what's different here. And I think to the same point that Tamara said, something is different. And the book is an outgrowth. I like to say that there is no such thing as objective commentary of the Torah. Everybody views every text, but certainly the Torah, through their own lens. And I say that the Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra was poor. He looked at his explanation of the Torah through a poor man's lens. And the Abarbanel, Rabbi Isaac Dan Abarbanel, who was the finance minister of Portugal and Spain, was thrown out of Spain by the monarchy, and he hated the monarchy. And so there is no such thing as an objective view, and everybody brings kind of their own baggage to looking at it. And my baggage is economics. And slowly over time, I began to hit at this intersection, although I should have been aware of it earlier, between long-term values that are rooted in 4,000 years and have kind of survived the test of time. I'm fond of saying that despite the fact that we post on social media every day, the Torah, the Bible, has the largest number of unique users in the world and in all history. And we needed to find anchors in these challenging times. And with that, I want to actually ask you what I think is not a trivial question, which is, you mentioned to me in our pre-discussion that you grew up in what you would have called almost a Christian environment in London. How do you hit on what are the real values on which you can build a company and decide to move to Israel if that's the environment that you grow up in?
So I did. I grew up obviously in a Jewish home and with Jewish values, but went to a Christian school, St. Paul's Girls' School in London. I don't think there are many people living in Israel that went to St. Paul's. And I do think, though, how...
Those with an American accent, St. Paul's is St. Paul's.
That's where my London accent still comes through. Those are the words. And I mean, definitely my family. I got a lot of that from my family. You know, we were brought up that, you know, if something good happens to you, celebrate it by, you know, spreading the good with other people. Tikkun olam is something that, you know, was spoken around the dinner table. But I think that there's having read your book. I really was shocked that there are so many things that resonate with me and that I feel like are the values that I'm living my life by them. That, you know, that you sort of explain how, you know, where they come from. And for me, it was like a really eye-opening in the sense of, obviously none of these things, I didn't think we thought about them, but it was like a really fantastic experience to sort of see and think about it and question where these values come from. Because I think a lot of us that grew up in non-religious households, there's this sort of idea of Jewish values, and the connection of those values to the actual Torah is something that I hadn't, I don't know well. So for me, that was very eye-opening.
One of the things that's been fascinating, I sent out a bunch of pre-copies of the book. A friend of mine, well-known investor on Wall Street, Gavin Baker, just tweeted about it today. He thinks it's a great book on venture capital. And one of the things I've discovered in sending out pre-copies and the reaction to the Hebrew version is that timeless principles actually resonate. And we find them, to your point, we find them oftentimes in our homes. We find them in business. We find them among people who have real impact out there. I think the question becomes, and we should explore this, is we live in a time where so much has become relativist. You know, it kind of sways in the wind. People change their mind around what's moral, ethical, values-driven, you know, with the political winds, and political winds change quickly. So for me, you know, the timeless value when the seas are rough and the politicians are waving this way and relativism, you know, the latest zeitgeist and bon ton changes every few weeks, and who's the enemy and who's the oppressed and who's the villain changes and gets swept up. So I go back to, for me, the Torah, which involves interpretation and modernization of it on some level. That's where I go back to. Where do you go back to in that?
My dad.
It's a great answer, by the way.
I think that
If you don't know her dad's an amazing guy.
But also
Deeply values.
regardless of that, I think he is a deeply, he always told me, that, for example, before I met my husband, he said, he would say, you need to find someone that shares your values. That's the most important thing. And I think that's the household that I grew up in. So I do think, though, that our generation is connecting to values on a different level and starting to bring those values not only from the home, but also into the business space.
So when I met Tamara, together with Yuval, who I knew before, they walk in the door. It's important to tell the story. They walk into the Aleph office, and they said, Yuval says, "You don't want to invest in this company." And I said, well, why not? He said, well, first of all, we're going to target the Israeli market. And for those of you not paying attention, there's like 9 million people in this country. It's not a giant market. There are bigger markets out there, like 1.5 billion Indians on the way, 400 million Americans. Even the UK is a bigger market. He said, we're going to target Israel. I said, okay. And he said, and we're going to kind of do this lean startup way. We're going to iterate and iterate. And by the way, we want to start with single mothers. And Tamara says, yes, we're going to go convince single mothers to be financially resilient. And I said, okay, who's going to go convince them? And she said, me. And I'm thinking about this young woman entrepreneur who went to St. Paul's going in to convince single mothers in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Netivot, Sderot about financial resilience.
And I also didn't speak much Hebrew. So
Right, and her Hebrew was weak. And I'm going, this doesn't feel like a really good idea from an investment perspective, but boy, if we can solve this here, this is a hard problem, and the best problems are hard problems, because if you can fix them, you've created a big competitive moat. And two amazing people, we should do this. And oh, by the way, financial resilience that starts with single moms, that matters. And we'll go do this, and good values will create a good business, which I think it's on the way to doing. And so, similar to the previous question, I should say one thing. I told the Rise Up story over maybe 3 or 4 months ago, and there's a famous line in the Torah, "V'chei achicha imach," which means and your brother will live with you. And when I grew up in New York, that was always kind of a mitzvah tzedakah. I now understand it entirely different. I now understand it in the context of, if it's your brother and he lives with you, because it says both your brother and with you, that's like a rising tide lifts all boats. If you can lift up the brother, actually the whole economy grows. I think it's an economic insight, not a charitable insight at this point. And that was kind of one of the things I've now kind of learned and taken away as part of this process with Rise Up. But I think similar to the previous thing, where you say you go to your dad, right? So it's to be a contrarian in the relativist world we live in, and to say, I'm going to go do Israel, and oh, by the way, the high school graduate for St. Paul's with poor Hebrew is going to go convince single moms in Israel. Where do you find the strength to be a contrarian in these matters and go do that?
Well, it's a big question. I'm
not paid here to ask easy questions,
You said we're going to have some fun, so here we can. I think that there's, I was talking about it actually this weekend. I think that there is a lot that I learned from Israel and Israelis, and a lot that I actually had to unlearn from my British education. I think that when I moved here, I immediately got lifted up by the whirlwind of the the tech scene and entrepreneurs, and you sit with one person, they introduce you to 10 more and really want to help you. And the vibe, the sort of chutzpah that you can go and talk to anyone anytime, and if you don't pick up their phone call, people continue to call you, which is an amazing Israeli phenomenon. But it's so counter to the way that I was brought up. The way that I was brought up was, you speak when it's your turn, and you don't question everything. And I think that I got a huge amount actually from the sort of the ecosystem here, the community here, that really helps and says, okay, go for it. I did move here though with the goal that we could build a success story, that we would build a company that would be a fantastic business and that would help people as it grew. And it would have a real impact. And so when we started, when we were talking and we came to talk to you, the vibe was, social impact is not something we want to talk about.
It's not a business.
It's not a business, exactly. We make money here, and then we give money on the other side, and that's the way it's always been, and that's the way it will continue to be. And I think 5 years later, now I was just in New York, sitting with a bunch of venture capital people, investors, and everyone was talking about ESG. And I was shocked because it's become something that the consumers and the employees are starting to demand, which is an alignment between the brands and the products that they're consuming and their values.
As you know, one of the cases I make in the book is that CSR in particular, which is corporate social responsibility, and maybe even ESG, although that's a little different, are different than the model of riseup, for example, or different than the model in the book. And it's the biblical view in my view is that when principles lie at the core of the business is actually better. It's not like this is a charity on the side. We'll do corporate social responsibility and give some money to the local youth group, or give some money to a charity or a food kitchen. It's if at the core of the business model there are fundamental principles and values, in the 21st century, the businesses are actually better. And I think that's kind of one of the secrets of riseup, which is the core of the business model, much like the case with Lemonade, where the core of the business model resolved the fundamental conflict of interest between the insurance company that old line insurance companies make money when they reject your claims. I hate to tell you that, but in your hour of sorrow, when your living room's been flooded or you had a car accident, the insurance companies, other than Lemonade, actually make money by rejecting your claim. That's their business model. And when Lemonade untangled that, they put the principles and the values at the core of the business, and that reduces fraud, which lowers the costs and lowers the cost for everybody. 25% or so of your insurance premiums because other people are fraudulent. Of course, nobody in the audience is, but other people. And those kind of deep values at the core of the business, I think, is what differentiates these businesses.
I agree, and also I think that if you're looking at it only from an investor's lens, and only from a startup and a focus lens, then you can't, with time, if your top line metric doesn't include both the impact that you want to have and the business model, then you sort of don't know where to steer the ship. So I think it's super important.
That's a great point, right? Startups can only optimize for one top line metric at a time, basically. And if it's not aligned and intertwined, it doesn't work. And at some point it will come into conflict. So back to the question I asked you before, because I'm going to keep digging on it. So when I was in yeshiva, so I remember Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, who was the other head of the yeshiva, telling over a midrash, a parable about Avraham Avinu that always had a huge impact on me. It says that Avraham came to Sulama Shel Tzor, which is in Lebanon today, and he saw that they were having a lot of fun, which, by the way, anachronistically reflects a lot of the Phoenician culture that comes later. And they were partying and too much going on. And then he looked across the border to Israel, and he saw that they were plowing at the time of plowing and weeding at the time of weeding and getting rid of the rocks on the field at the time of the rocks. And he said, that's where I want to make my life. And I often think about that midrash in the context of startup entrepreneurs, because you have to do what's not the zeitgeist. People want to have fun. People don't want to be held down by values. And he said, hard work matters. Staying to a time schedule matters. And by the way, being different matters. The slogan at Aleph is different is better than better. With Avraham Avinu's imprimatur on that, right? Being different matters. But it's hard. It's actually not easy, right? Because there's expectations of other investors, and even me. And so where do you find strength in that way to be different and not get out of line? And to put the hard work in and stay to the schedule, and reject, I'd call it the party culture of startups. It's a pretty lean startup, by the way, even a very.
We definitely don't have a party culture. First of all, I really, really, really believe in what we're doing. And I really believe that we will successfully make a huge impact here and then in the world. I chose fantastic partners that are aligned with me on our values. It was actually the first conversations that we had were values conversations.
What were the values initially?
Our values are everything is possible, which goes back to the that sort of Israeli vibe that beginner's mind, and you can you come learning every day and you reinvent yourself essentially every day. Teamwork, which we have a whole tour about what teamwork means for us, and in a lot of intense feedback and personal growth. And humility is our third value, and that came from Yuval moved back from Stockholm when I made Aliyah, and we were looking for a problem that we could solve in Israel, and we went around these sort of startup, from Tel Aviv, went to visit different government bodies, different charities, and someone said to us, it's great that you guys are deciding to do this, and I really believe in, I'm very excited that you're deciding to do good with your time, but just remember there are people that have spent their entire careers dealing with these issues. And that's something that we constantly remind ourselves. That I'm coming to talk to the room of single mothers. I've never been in their position, and so I have to come with humility. But to answer your question, I think that we are very good at keeping each other in line and bringing each other back up when needed.
You mentioned in passing that there is a whole Torah around leadership, around teamwork.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
We have a book that the 5 dysfunctions of a team, which everyone who joins the company reads, and we've written our own version of it, and we continue to practice that all the time, and we've created, we have squads that work autonomously and very strong individual contributors, and I don't think we could have created that culture had we not started out. But even before we came to speak with you, even before we had our idea, we decided what the values of this company were going to be.
I heard from somebody, I haven't had a chance to ask Yuval yet, that also Yuval tells the story now of Elkanah. Have you heard this? You were on maternity leave also for a while, right?
Yeah, I just came back from maternity.
That he started telling the story of Elkanah. There's an amazing story brought down in the Midrash also about Elkanah, that on his way to the tabernacle, to the Mishkan in Shiloh, he would gather up all the people to come with him. And that's kind of the job of riseup, is to gather up all the people. I want to change the topic. So I grew up in Orthodox Jewish day school and Orthodox Jewish home in New York. Although my grandfathers were in business, religious families are conservative homes with a small c, by definition. I can't imagine that the education at St. Paul's was anything other than conservative with a small c. And the high-tech world is anything but conservative. It breaks existing paradigms. It goes to the future. What do you think enabled you to break out of that conservative education and viewpoint?
I think there's sort of the moment where you decide you're going to take the plunge and you're going to go move to this crazy place called Israel, and you just sort of say, okay, I'm doing it. I really do think, though, I had to shed some things that came with that conservative. It's really a conservative and slightly narrow-minded way of thinking is sort of I'm very grateful for the education I got. It was fantastic. But in many ways it doesn't help me in my day-to-day. Like, I feel like there's a lot. We just had a son, and we're talking a lot about education. Yeah. And we're talking a lot about education, and so there are many good things that come from British upbringing, like how to use your knife and fork and your napkins, and say please and thank you, and a lot of things that I see with Israeli kids, and I'm like, wow. But there is something with the sort of the lack of hierarchy, the lack of rules, the fact that children. I was told children should be seen and not heard. That wasn't in my family, but that was within the.
My parents tried that with us too. It didn't work.
So that's it. It kind of worked, and so I think that there's a lot to take from the from Israeli society and sort of the values of ask all the questions. I'm sure that there are values that come obviously from also from religious and sort of the yeshiva way of asking questions and constantly questioning things. But I think that that's something that I just decided, okay, I'm diving right in, and I'm still learning how to do, to be honest.
I think when I talk to high school kids who come from Orthodox background, this is still difficult. It's changing a bit, but it's a difficult topic. One is because it's hard to fail and go to shul, to the Beit Knesset, the next Shabbat. It really is. It's legitimately hard, and risk-taking involves failure. And some of my conversations in launching the book in the U.S., where I've been interviewed by a number of what I would call Christian deep faith community outlets, it's a hard problem there too. It's hard to fail and go into church or shul the next day, and the family takes it seriously too. It's not just an individual thing. I was actually thinking today, coming here, I give my parents a lot of credit for pushing us and I guess enabling us to fail along the way. But it's not obvious, and as technology takes over more of the economy, how conservative communities are able to take risk, step out of the box while maintaining their values and identity, while maintaining what they really is a real challenge, but an important one to tackle. Somebody who interviewed me for a podcast in the States, in Texas, said the inability to talk about the Bible in terms of technology is an inhibitor, because if the Bible is separate from technology and innovation, then it doesn't have what to say. And if technology and innovation is separate, then it runs away. And so kind of holding on to timeless values while you innovate is, I think, critical. And one of the pieces, go ahead.
No, I wanted to ask you what you tell the high school kids.
The first thing I tell them is to get married young. That's the first thing I tell them. No, I say this is serious. And
I've heard him say that before.
and part of the reason is, I think, like in business you find partners and you do better when you find partners in business. I think in life you do better when you find partners and you grow up together. And I think there's a notion in modern society, I have to find myself first, then I can find a spouse. And I think we actually don't find ourselves until we find a life partner. And that's something I tell high school kids a lot. I think having children matters a lot. I got a note from a friend of mine in Detroit maybe 2 hours ago. He said, I read your piece. I had a piece published in the Times of Israel last week entitled Having More Children or something like that. I didn't create the title. And he said, I read your piece and I totally agree. All the pessimists in the world don't want to have children. And writes me a guy in Detroit, not Jewish for what it's worth. We have 5 children. And I come from a family of 6, and God bless, we need to have more children. I think having children teaches you unconditional love, and that kids fail and entrepreneurs fail, and you got to take risks, and you got to be there for them unconditionally. That's the second thing I tell high school kids. And the third thing I tell them is, I don't think this is a dichotomous world. I think historically there's been a view that in order to be creative, you can't have solid, timeless values. And in order to be at the bleeding edge of technology, you can't stay true to your timeless values. And I think that's false. And one of the things I've learned being in Israel, and I think Israel is ahead of this, and this I find interesting about your coming here. There's like a magnet that attracted you here. It says, where I find my family values, and you mentioned your grandmother and your grandfather, is here in Israel. I think there's something unique about the air here, the people here, that lets a broader range of people take risk. It lets a broader range of society innovate and create, and still manage to kind of drive a stake on the values and the core of the business. I don't know why 100% it's the case. It's like you said, I got it at home. My dad my grandfather, my grandmother, I grew up in a Christian school, but it pulled me back here. And I think it's not an accident that, Rise Up, Lemonade, and Healthy I.O. and business like that are getting created here. It's not an accident, in my view. I don't know what you think.
No, I fully agree, and I think that the best thing that Israel can be is an exporter of those kinds of companies, and that's what excites me. And I think that there are more and more and more companies that are entrepreneurs. By the way, Israel has fantastic social entrepreneurs. That was one of the things that I was really impressed with when I came. And I think now they're starting to also understand the use of technology. So I think there's going to be more and more sort of companies that are tech companies but are using their values.
I used to say people with kippot would become social entrepreneurs and people without would become technology entrepreneurs, but those two are merging now, and I think that's a very positive development. I want to challenge us on something. So, and this is a tricky topic. I wrote a tweet today, and in one of the subtweets it said that in the next 6 to 12 months there'll be $10 billion of wealth in the Tel Aviv area coming off of lockup. Hello. Yeah, coming off of lockup. So there's been a bunch of IPOs over the last 12 months, companies going public, and by my best calculation, $10 billion of that belongs to people who live in the area of Tel Aviv broadly. Somebody at the tax authority told me they think the number is 14. I hope they know how to count because they're in the tax authority, but by my calculation, it's 10 billion, 8 to 10 billion, and it might depend on the day of the stock market. And Israel went from being a poor country supported by the diaspora, and still those partnerships are super important, and it's a family that lives across oceans. By the same token, it's becoming a more wealthy country. And we're right now in the middle of the Parshat HaShavua, the weekly portions, part of which they deal with is what happens when Israeli society accumulates wealth. And the Torah is worried about this. It says, V'ram levavecha v'shachachta et Hashem Elokecha, you become haughty of the heart, and you'll forget God, and you'll forget the values that you came from, and you'll say, I built all this, kochi v'otzem yodi asali et hachai elazeh, and you become haughty. It's my strength, my hand who did this. And one of the chapters, as I'm sure you read, was about Avraham, was about Abraham, and his approach to wealth. I'm fond of quoting Nachmanides, the Ramban, who says at the beginning of the Parashat Toldot that one of the blessings to the forefathers is that they would be wealthy. It's inherent in the blessing. And he uses that to say that there's no way that Isaac could have been poor, which is what I said before. The Ibn Ezra says that Isaac was poor. Maybe some self-reflection. And so how does this emerging wealthy society with skyrocketing real estate, and you are daily engaged in helping people rise up, get out of overdraft in the bank, put some savings in the bank, but still look at a daunting prospect of how do I afford an apartment? The cost of living is going up here. How do I afford that? How do you think about that challenge here?
I think it's a huge challenge. I think that it's something that we need to be addressing. I think that Rise Up is going to help a lot of people in this because part of the issue is that the gap is huge. The gap between Tel Aviv and the rest of the country is already immense. When you look at, we were going around, before COVID hit, we were going around schools and talking with teachers all over the country. And the amount of the startup nation or the technology that has impacted their lives is basically ways, and that's it. And the world and the reality of Tel Aviv and people who are in the tech scene is totally disconnected. And I think that we need to find business models. I think that we need to find startups that are going to help to bridge this gap. I strongly believe in the harnessing the power of business and markets in order to solve social issues, obviously. But I think that it's something that we need to be addressing because it's getting more and more and more.
What would be your prescriptions?
Need to think about it. What are yours?
That's not fair. One of the things I talk about in the book is what I call the difference between Andrew Carnegie, Warren Buffett, and Avraham Avinu. For those of you who don't know, Andrew Carnegie wrote a booklet, a pamphlet on wealth, and I think Warren Buffett has been one of the most articulate spokesmen for how to think about wealth. I don't fully agree with him, but I think he's been super articulate and upfront about it. So Buffett has this view that he won the DNA lottery, or the ovarian lottery, sometimes he calls it. And because of that, he was lucky. He says, I could have been born in Bangladesh, but I was born in America at exactly the right time of economic prosperity, and I was lucky, and therefore I should kind of give it away. And he's given a large percentage of his wealth away to the Gates Foundation to let Bill Gates manage it. Carnegie has what I would call a paternalistic view of managing wealth. He thinks that people are wealthy because they're talented, and they've gotten to that point, and so they have a responsibility by dint of that talent to manage wealth on behalf of other segments of society. I think the model of the Torah is different. I think the model of Israeli society as based on Avraham is one of Brit, which means that there's a covenant. That means we're all kind of in this together. And it's not paternalistic, and it doesn't matter, lucky. I may have been successful, but that success means I'm more responsible. I'm more responsible not to give, or as Carnegie calls it, manage on behalf of, but I'm responsible to enable. I'm responsible to enable the growth of somebody else. And in the beginning of Parashat Lech Lecha, the third portion, the Torah tells us that Avraham comes to the land of Israel, and I think this is like a model for future generations. He makes Aliyah. He also didn't have a great upbringing, or may have had the then Christian upbringing or schooling in Haran, and he comes to Israel, and the Bible tells us he brings his wife and 70 people and his nephew, Lot. And we know one thing about his nephew Lot, and that is he's an orphan. And Avraham enables him to become wealthy. He becomes wealthy by being in Avraham's stead. And I think to me that's part of the Brit. We all need to enable a broader societal success. And not just that a rising tide raises all boats, it's appropriate not to feel entitled. It's appropriate to be an enabler of other people's success. When I think about the technology point you made earlier, so Tamara doesn't know that when she and Yuval came to see me, like the thought that occurred to me is exactly what she said about ways. One of the barriers, and this was a big risk as an investor, is the communities that they were targeting were not technology sophisticated, and that's a huge barrier. But and I think what you're saying, if you get over that barrier, both the investment prize and the societal prize is enormous, and that's captivating as an investor, and I think kind of really at the core of the Abrahamic faiths and kind of the message of Avraham to come do that.
I think one of the things that is one of the more depressing things is that your zip code more or less predicts how much money you're going to make in the future. And that's what we're like in riseup. That's what we want to solve, to open more and more opportunities. I think, in a sense, Israel, because of the army, because of the way that the country is run, it's very different than in the U.S. You have these sort of huge universities that are very expensive. Here, the barrier to entry is there are many issues, but there, I think, is an infrastructure in order to change that, in order to sort of create social mobility, which is a problem all over the world. But I do think that we have sort of an edge here in the way that Israel has been. But I'm very interested in what you said, the fact that the Torah looks badly on Israel, the nation of Israel being wealthy.
I'm not sure it looks badly on wealthy. I think it says this will come to happen, right? And you become successful. And by the way, you'll come into the land, you'll find all sorts of houses you didn't build and vineyards you didn't plant, and you'll say, I did this. And I think it's cautionary more than it looks badly. If this is a blessing to the forefathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It's a blessing in Dvarim, but it's really cautionary. And I think it talks about the societal challenges that I think you relate to. And to me, when I was doing the math to try to calculate this, I'm looking at this and saying, this is unbelievable. This is, when I moved here in 1993, you still thought about the blue boxes from Keren Kayemet L'Yisrael, and now you have this fantastic wealth around Tel Aviv, and then you go, oh man, we got a lot of work to do. This is a challenge that as a technology economy, and I'll speak for the economy that we both live in, can't be pushed off on somebody else. And it's the tools to go do that I think are really challenging. I want to relate to one point you said and one point I think you may have intimated. I think the Army point is super fundamental. And I think this joint Army service creates a solidarity and an ability to create solidarity that is really important. One of the things I said on the same podcast in Texas, he said, what would be your prescription for America on the wealth gaps? I said, mandatory military service in the U.S. I think it matters. And I'm actually hoping that the reduction in the age of the Ptor for Charedim here will enable more people to get both into the economy first and then ultimately solidarity. But I want to touch on a point I think you intimated towards. No, I won't say it so carefully. Because of the pace of technology, it really is hard for the government to keep up. And so the solutions to these issues of empowerment, of rising up financially, which I think historically in Israel in particular, we viewed as the job of the government, actually can't be their job. They can't solve it in the way Rise Up can solve it. Just like things are moving too quickly, and the challenges are emerging too quickly. And so one question, last question I'll ask you, and then Rabbi Chaim wants to take some questions from the audience. When you think about the role of private industry and technology versus the role of government going forward, where do you draw the line on that? And then if you have any closing thoughts before Rabbi Chaim.
I think in general, trust is an issue today, and it's on the governmental level, and it's on other levels also of big corporations. I feel like when I want to think about tackling a problem the size of what you just outlined, what gives me hope is the entrepreneurs. What gives me hope is the people that are sitting here and are building companies and contributing to companies that are gonna change it from the base. I think what we are trying to do at Rise Up is revolutionary because the business model is different. It goes against the traditional business model that we have to sell you financial products, and we have an interest to keep you in overdraft. We have an interest to keep you in loans. And so I don't know exactly where the line is, but I would like to see startups and tech taking more of the share of sort of how do we tackle social problems.
I kind of view this as a civic responsibility at this point. I think, by the way, going back to what I said before about the v'chei achicha imach, v'chei achicha imach, your brother should live with you, is a civic responsibility. The Torah does not devolve it to the king. In fact, it says the king will take your property. That's what it says in Sefer Shmuel. He'll take your property and take your children. That's the government. It's a civic responsibility to do this. And just to finish on one point, in one of the other parts of the book, I explore when Yaakov comes to the well to ultimately find Rachel and find a wife. There's a giant rock on the well. And my entire childhood, I thought that Yaakov was Superman. And he walked up to this giant rock on the well and moved it aside. And only when kind of ruminating on this longer did I realize that giant rock on the well was regulation. And the reason the following: there was no trust in that society. In the book, I get into why there was no trust in that society. There was no trust in the society, and Rabbi Avraham, the son of the Rambam, says something similar. And so they needed a rock on the well in order to make sure that the shepherds of the different flocks didn't steal water or didn't take too much water, which was a scarce resource, from the other shepherds. And so they wait there. And the lack of productivity drives Yaakov crazy. There's a giant rock on the well, and everyone's waiting around and wasting time. It was like a big bureaucracy. And he walks over because he grew up in a house of trust and says, I'm not constrained by this lack of trust, and I'll move the rock off the well, and he feeds the flock, and productivity is enhanced by this act, this civic act of somebody who grows up in a house of trust. And if we go back to Rabbi Shlomo's comment earlier about the friarim, I think this is a lot of your point, is the more you're a friar, actually, the more trust you create, I think, ironically, because you want to give. And I think I can think of no more shining example than you, and your Aliyah path to kind of lead in this path of trust to all sorts of populations in Israel. So thanks for doing this with me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Michael and Tamara.
I should point out we're sharing microphones because we all took COVID tests before, so we're good.
We're going to move on to the Q&A. Our main rule of Q&A is not making statements, having a clear question, asking it, and then letting our speakers answer. But first, we have two questions from the crowd online. So you ended off with civic responsibility, and both of you take action with your civic responsibility. What can everyone here do in civic responsibility? At the end of the day, you guys have to remember you did Aliyah, and that's something that is very normal in Chutz La'aretz. In Israel, I grew up in Israel my whole life, even though I have a fake American accent. But we're very good with family and friends. But civic responsibility was something that I only learned when I moved to Tel Aviv 12 years ago, and I started living amongst Olim much more, and that there is a concept of that. In Israel, you drive down the road, the guy will honk at you because you cut him off, and then he'll block you and tell you, oh, the mattress that you have on top of your car is not tied right, and he'll help you tie it down. We know when
That's
we're in
civic responsibility.
Yeah, but that's when we get to catastrophes. What can we do? And this is an open question to both of you. What should we focus on? Maybe that's the better question, is what should, as a society now, people that are sitting right here, men and women, what should we be focusing on to really accomplish civic responsibility?
Might be controversial. I think that as much as you can align what you're working for in your daily life to civic responsibility, that's the only way that we're going to solve the issue that Michael outlined. And that means that starting a company that has a mission, joining a company that is values driven, but as long as the idea remains that we can work on one side and sort of, tie someone's mattress to the car on the other side or donate money, I feel like we won't be able to create the revolution that we really need to create in order to bridge the gap.
So I agree partly, meaning I agree fully with what you said in terms of I think the best way to make the change is to start a company and innovate technology because technology scales to go solve these problems. That is the best way. But I think it's also a mindset. Ironically, I think that the pandemic has revealed a lot of the flaws in thinking that the government, not just in Israel, globally, will solve problems. Like I said, things are just moving too quickly. Even the spread of a pandemic, which hops on an airplane and comes down here and goes there, and it's a variant, it's too fast for the mechanisms of government that are a little bit somewhere between the Pony Express and the Model T. And my significant optimistic view of the world is that people woke up during this pandemic and said, if we don't take care of it, no one will. And I think there is, I keep coming back to the statement, so many statements in the Torah, are minded towards civic responsibility. They're minded towards, you do it with him, he does it with you, we do it together, we get a better outcome. That Avraham Avinu came with 70 other people. It's a civic responsibility. And I think the Torah is very minded. I think it's a mindset. And by the way, one of the most important things about entrepreneur mindset is they don't pass by a problem and say it's somebody else's problem. And I think if you walk away with something tonight is whatever problem you see is your problem. It's nobody else's. It's your problem. And that's, I think that's a deep value of this country. It's your problem. You wouldn't think twice in the Army of saying it's somebody else's problem. So when you take off the madim, it's also your problem. It's not the government's problem. And if we all think that the fact that the street's dirty is our problem, if the fact that single moms need to get out of overdraft because the banks are taking advantage of them is tomorrow's problem, then we solve them.
Thank you. One more question, and then we will move on to the crowd. This is a personal question to both of you. Michael, this is maybe a value from the Torah and value from your father, but one value that made you walk away from a good deal, from something in life, something personal in life that made you walk away because you wanted to stick to your values, and what was the outcome of it?
I passed on an investment in a company that has done really well. It is worth, I won't mention the name of the company. It's worth many billions and billions of dollars because when I got to the bottom of the due diligence, which I should say I rarely do, but something was niggling at me, I found out that a significant percentage of their customers were losing money through the service. And I just couldn't get there. And it probably cost my LPs a lot of money.
We have this issue a lot when it comes to partnerships, because often we're helping people. We have great access, great engagement with our consumers who are very attractive consumers to other financial institutions, and so I think that we often I won't go into specifics, but we've often made decisions based on the fact that this might bring us a bunch of customers, but at the end of the day, it goes against what we're trying to protect, which is them and their values.
That's happened multiple times at this company, where they've given up on significant, meaningful partnerships with brand names you would all know in this room and you may have in your wallet, because it would compromise the values of the company.
And we will continue to.
Okay, now I turn to the crowd. Yes.
Just say your name.
Maybe this is more of an anthropological question, but I think of my contemporaries in high tech, and very few of them are avid readers of the Torah. So I wonder, what do you think is the sort of cultural or anthropological mechanism through which so many people in this country have built this mindset and this sort of shared value system and this value-driven model of living, even though they maybe didn't have similar backgrounds or such a focus on maybe religion or the Torah, or what is that stone or what is that cultural glue that has given this people that special sauce?
This is the reason I wanted this combination up here tonight, among others. Listen to Tamara.
Well, I can only talk about my personal experience. I think that first of all, there is something in the, as an Olah, when you arrive in Israel, there is something in the community here that is very, very strong. Something that I've lived in many places in the UK and all over the US, and I didn't have that. And I think that you get a lot of those values from the community that welcomes you here, from the way that people interact with you when you arrive. I think that the ideas of the things that we spoke about already, that of giving back, of tikkun olam, of it's my problem. I feel like the conversation is very different in Israel, and I don't know exactly what it is, what it sits on. I'm sure that Michael will have a better answer on that front, but I think that it's something that sort of just happens here, and that it is something that in a sense the values are sort of values of yesterday is something that we talk about, of the sort of neighborhood values, the neighborly values, the way that we treat our neighbors, the way that we question things that we see, and I think it's just something that's very, very unique to Israel, and that wasn't actually, even in the Jewish community that I was somewhat part of in London, it didn't have that element.
I think about this like a lot, and I don't have a great answer. And the term you use, anthropological, is actually a really good one, and I hadn't thought of that at all. I'll give you two other words. I have a metaphysical view of this, which is somewhere deep down, everyone understands that this is a family. And ironically, the family is defined genetically. The family is defined historically. The family is defined religiously, and it's defined in some ways geographically, which I think is the last point Tamara was making. And families can often be dysfunctional too. They argue a lot. But at the end of the day, they're a family. And the kind of metaphysics of this place, I think, is that it's a family. And so despite the genuine, deep disagreements and shouting that often happens at the family Thanksgiving table, to use an American metaphor, it's still a family. That's the metaphysical answer to the question. I have maybe it's anthropological. I think of it as an educational, but more importantly, as a vocabulary answer. And so there's a fair amount of research that says that things that we learn between 4 and 14 basically define a lot about who we are: tastes, vocabulary, etc. And words that we hear repeatedly during those ages get deeply ingrained. And there is something about, I'd say, the Jewish home broadly, but the Israeli home in particular, which, with incredible genius, the founders of this country used the Hebrew language to do. And necessarily, the Hebrew language derives from the Torah, because that's the basic first source of the Hebrew language. And by so doing, we have teleported a language from 4,000 years ago into modern terms, and therefore, by nothing else than idioms and expressions, we create in 4 to 14-year-olds a language that is reminiscent of the Torah and of those timeless values, even idioms, right? We still call offenses like a gader, and there's also a ma'akeh. Ma'akeh is a hapax legomenon, a single-use word in the Torah. Through sheer genius of insisting that it wasn't going to be British English or Yiddish to be the language of the country, but rather resuscitating the Hebrew language, we've created a 4,000-year generational bond into a formative language. And I think I studied some deconstructionism, philosophy of deconstructionism. Language creates society in large measure, and I think that's part of what's worked.
I just want to add on that, that I feel like I have a sense that Israel and we all in Israel are still writing our history. And that's something that I definitely don't have that sense about other places that I've lived. And so I think that it's it's the connection backwards, but it also puts us on a certain curve forward.
That's a superb point. With a friend of mine, we've been using the term, I talked to a bunch of people who are thinking about making Aliyah all the time. I keep telling them, join the project. This is still a project.
It feels like a project.
Right, it feels like a project. It's still a project. And it's messy and it's complicated and it falls apart sometimes and it fails and it's okay.
But it's ours.
It's ours, yeah.
Next question. Anyone from this sector? Yes, second row.
No, she's not tested.
No, right.
Just speak up loud.
Speak up loud. Is there a question? I'm sorry that I'm stopping you in the middle of the statement. Question.
I write books. What? She said she thinks the CEOs starting and running these companies need Torah. What are you going to do about it? I said, I write books. So, well, we have conversations. We write books. We have a language. And I think the more we show, and this is, I think, is Tamara's point, that these companies that values are at the core are more valuable companies. One of the lines I've been using is values create value, meaning values create economic value. The more people get drawn to it, the more we create Israel as the epicenter of that, the more it drives the conversation from here. Yeah. Listen, most people are, don't take this the wrong way, more people are connected to business than are connected to Torah. We should just say that very clearly. And more people are connected to innovation, are connected to Torah. So therefore, the best carrier is actually business and innovation.
Yes.
Loud.
Well, first of all, it's sort of what we touched on earlier. The question was that values need practice in order for them to continue to be true, and so how within a company do you continue to do that? And I think that we touched on it before, the top line metric, because when you come to work, you open your computer, you look at your top line metric, and you say, how am I going to serve this? So that has to reinforce the social value or whatever value you're trying, not only the economic value that you're trying to create. And beyond that, I think that we're still discovering it. We're only a few years old, but you have to. We're constantly reinforcing the values. And the nice thing is that when new people join the company, we say to them, "All right, now it's your turn to reinforce the values and to pass them on." And that's the moment where they really connect to the values.
We do the same thing. We have Olive onboard packet, and the most recent person reads it and then updates it, and therefore makes it their own. Thank you. That's a civic service. That's way to take responsibility. Thank you. One of the benefits of studying Talmud is you learn some great lines to respond to a question like that. And it says, since the destruction of the Second Temple, prophecy has been given to fools. So I'm not going to dare to answer that question of when. Markets have ups and downs. Countries have ups and downs. People have ups and downs. Change is constant. Innovation is actually constant, by the way. Periods of innovation come in waves. Carol Perez's famous waves of technology is a useful framework for that. But innovation comes in waves, and I think there'll always be innovation. I think the bigger part to your question is Tamara's point earlier, which is how do we spread it, right? Because We need to find new engines of growth that are both broader in the economy to more sectors of the economy, more populations, because resilience is created by a diversity of an economy. So if one place takes a hit, the other recovers for it. You know, the pandemic killed tourism in this country, it should be clear. But on a national level, the high-tech economy made up for it in spades. That doesn't help the people in the tourism business, per se. By the way, that's also civic responsibility. And so we need to figure this out on how to have more engines of growth for broader sections of the economy so that it is more resilient to whatever shock comes, because just like change is constant, shock is constant too. Yes.
Hi, my name is Ari. We've been talking tonight a lot about social impact startups, and a lot of these new social impact startups that are getting started are typically very, very early stage companies. They're pre-seed or they're seed stage companies. We've talked tonight a lot about how there's this ever-increasing amount of money that's coming into the country for investment, but a lot of this money is also going to later stage seeds, companies that are in A, B, C rounds, and so on and so forth. Part of the difficulty is that a lot of these smaller companies, the social impact companies that are looking for investments, are only looking for relatively small amounts of money that are difficult for larger VC funds to justify spending the time in trying to fund. So my question for you, Mr. Eisenberg, is,
Michael, Mr. Eisenberg's my dad.
well, Michael, how do you see Olive VC, if you think that Olive VC should try to expand to offer more early stage, very, very early stage deals, or do you think it's a pipeline problem? Where do you see yourself in the ecosystem trying to participate?
First of all, I want to change a term you used, which is social impact. I don't think what? I don't think riseup, for what it's worth, is a social impact company at all. It's just a business, and a good business, because it has values at its core, and because customers want to identify with those values and help them build a better business than the current services they are getting. It's just a better business. It's really a better business because it's based on timeless values. It is not social impact. This is not like some double bottom line, let's sacrifice the profits. This is not a charity. It's a business, and my investors, my LPs and Olive, expect to make a giant return on riseup, and we do too. And there's a lot of areas, you know, I think about Wix a lot, okay? So you would never have included Wix in your definition, but Wix put a ton of businesses online, a ton. And when this pandemic came, God bless, because Wix enabled people to be online, sell online, service online in a way that tens and hundreds of millions of businesses couldn't have done pre-pandemic. So that is enabling people to earn the honest and decent income I spoke about at the beginning of the conversation. And that's not social impact, that's a good business that enables other people and helps them earn an honest and decent living. And to the last point, so I'm coming to that. So the job of venture capitalists is to fund great disruptive businesses. We funded riseup. Yuval, Tamara, Yiftach. It's an amazing team tackling a really hard problem. It's got challenges. Like I said before, it's 9 million people in the country. Now it's financial services, so you can probably make enough money at it to create a big company. But it's not without challenges, but great teams solving really hard, meaningful problems, in my experience, get funded. There is enough money running around at the seed and pre-seed and early stage in this country now to fund any great idea out there. It's crazy how much money is running around, and there's going to be more, because when these people exercise their options, in addition to buying apartments, they're going to be angels, because that's just what happens.
All the way in the back. No.
Nadia, speak up. You're brave. She hasn't made all my mistakes. You may want her advice. You have to ask them the second part of that question, but I think it's important to be honest with kids. Really important. I'm not an expert in parenting. For that, you really need to talk to my wife, Yafa. She's really an expert in parenting, and is a real student of it, and is far better at it than. But yeah, I think it's important to be super transparent, and I talk about my investments that fail, and try to have as few as possible, but ethical failings also. We're all human beings, and we're all trying. And parenting, like business, like work, like everything, it's hard work, and you got to keep at it. The same guy from Detroit sent me an Arnold Schwarzenegger called The Video That Broke the Internet. I hadn't seen it, though, until today, in which he talks about the importance of hard work, and you got to keep going. And somebody asked, how many sit-ups do you do? He says, I don't start counting until it hurts. And it's like, it's a worthwhile video. It's worth watching, by the way. It's really amazing. And there's Torah and Arnold Schwarzenegger. And it's, I'll say something from one Olet to another. You'll always be an immigrant. And I'm here 28 years, since 1993. All my children were born here. I still feel like an immigrant. And my kids, I'm certain if you ask them, think that their father is really American. And they want to be Israeli. And so necessarily, and I want them to be Israeli, and necessarily then, in their eyes, I'm certain some things they think we just don't understand. And you know what? They're probably right. And so I'm sure, that makes us feel like we're not doing the right thing all the time. You have cultural arguments. We've had arguments with our kids for years over curfew. Curfew is an unheard of concept in Israel. Why, I don't know. But it is. And my wife and we have 8 children. We continue the good fight. And I'm certain if you ask them, they think we're nuts. Maybe they're right and we're wrong. But it will. I don't know how to offer you any consolation other than it'll always be harder, I think, for you, because our kids are growing up in a different culture than we grew up in. And my wife likes to say every year around our Aliyah anniversary that we made the decision to make Aliyah so that our kids wouldn't have to. And I think that's actually a super powerful point. And that's why I said she's the smarter parent. And I really believe that. I believe that making Aliyah when we did was a godsend. And having our children grow up here instead of in America right now is a tremendous blessing and bracha. And I feel very fortunate. I'm pretty certain that my great-grandfather would have given his arms and his legs. He wrote a book called Or Gulat Yisrael, The Light of the Redemption of Israel, in the early 50s. I think he would have given his arms and his legs to live here. And so I think, whatever failings we have, they're worth it.
Yes.
I humbly have to say that I honestly don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I haven't. I don't know even the state of the schools, even in Tel Aviv. So I will refrain?
There's a famous story about the Reichman family of Toronto. It's written up in one of the books about them, in which they ask one of the kids, why'd you go into real estate? He says, because my father was in real estate. He says, yeah, that's not a good enough reason. What's the reason? He says, well, the table conversation was about real estate. And that was the topic that they knew. And I think the table conversation at home matters more perhaps than even the schools. And I think outside of Tel Aviv, it's not just the schools, it's the table conversation is not about technology, because so few of the parents work in the technology industry when it's outside of the, maybe it's Gedera Chadera, maybe it's Tel Aviv environs. So I think that's point one. It's a language also, and it's a language that's talked about at the table. And so I wouldn't say it's only the school system. A lot has to do with the profession of the parents and the topics that interest the parents and what the table conversation is about. School system, in my personal view, broadly, and this is particularly true in the religious school system, is like a straitjacket. And unless you're learning 5 yechidot of math and computers, whatever it is, your odds of getting exposed to these areas is nil. And in the religious system, where there's additional pressures of more Torah and Gemara, which I'm in favor of, but you also have these requirements to do other things, you're not going to get that exposure. And add on to that in the areas outside of Tel Aviv, it's harder to get teachers to teach these innovative subjects. It's a problem. Yerucham has actually done a good job of that, by the way, but they're like an island in the desert. And they've done it, though, extracurricularly. They brought in first robotics competitions to Yerucham, and it made a huge change in the city. And so the best thing I can say is don't look in the school system, because that's part of the government problem. It's going to take forever to change. The best way to change it is a home conversation, and then to bring in outside competitions and projects like First Robotics, like Hackathon, and let your kid out of school to go explore these things. I know that's unpopular. Maybe I shouldn't say as a parent if my kids are watching, but I think it's okay. I think it's okay.
We have one more question. There will be time afterwards. There's still wine and dessert afterwards. We will let people, and there's still books to be sold and to be signed by Michael, so please feel free to stay around afterwards. Our last question will go to you.
How do you find ideas that what?
Ideas or companies that goes into that 20%. And my another question is, do you think in the future people with different ideology in that 20% will start to battle each other? Because it used to be kingdom versus kingdom, government versus government, but now we are starting to have less regulations. So do you think people in this 20% will start to go wild and try to fight each other?
I don't know. When I was a kid, I read a bunch of science fiction. By the way, Monica, that's another thing. Have your kids read science fiction. It's helpful, seriously. And I recently picked up a book by Sichin Liu called The Three-Body Problem, which is a lot about kind of what I would call elites fighting over technology. I don't know. It was mind-bending and mind-expanding, the book. I recommend it. But, I don't know. I think at the end of the day, creating a better world and investing is about finding good people that you want to partner with who care so passionately and deeply to make a change that they're willing to sacrifice large parts of their life for it, whether it's moving from Los Angeles and a film career or more lucrative opportunities. I'm fond of saying there are better ways to make money than to start a startup. Really, there are. In banking, they'll pay you more. There are better ways, and your chances of succeeding are actually higher outside of starting a startup. But ultimately, change comes about because of a few passionate people who are ideologues. And if you partner with the ones who, at least from my perspective, want to make a change that is, biblically driven or timeless value driven, and as we said before, it's kind of inherent in the language here, that's how you make change. That's my theory of change. There's a lot of talk about this in the philanthropic world. My theory of change is find just great entrepreneurs who at their core believe in these timeless values and are hell-bent on making that change happen using technological tools, because that's the only scalable and sustainable way to do it. And I admire those people. They're the real heroes. We just give money. I write books and write checks. She does the work, and it makes the real change. And that's the best way to make change, in my view.
So thank you again for everyone for joining us at Tel Aviv International Salons. We want to wish you, Michael, a lot of atzlacha with the new book, a lot of bracha. We want to wish you, Tamara, a lot of atzlacha with Rise Up, and you guys should go higher and beyond all your expectations.
Rise up.
They should rise up. And we welcome you all to join us for our next Tel Aviv International Salons that will be in October. We have the Australian ambassador, and then we have Dennis Prager joining us. So please join us on Facebook, join us online, and we would love to see you all. We should have a Shana Tova Umetuka with only good things, Be'ezrat Hashem.
Thank you so much. You guys were great.
Thanks, guys. That was great. Well done. That was very sensible, very sensible. I had practice, but I had yellow. I lived in Amsterdam for 22 years, and I moved 10 years ago with my 6 kids here. And I'm very inspired by what you do. No, I live in Australia. Amazing. Where did you live in London? So sorry, are you north or over there where we have sons? Yeah, and I did like this.
Worried about is my son's getting
I
married.
have 6 children. My daughter just had a baby 2 months ago, and she's on maternity.
No, he's okay. He's had it.
So I would like to know that she has a background in